The great chamber of the Galactic Council fell silent when the doors opened, and Commander Ethan Cole walked inside. Every eye in the room turned toward him, and every voice stopped mid-sentence as if someone had pressed a button to freeze time. Itself, Princess Lyri Kathvari watched from the diplomatic gallery above the main floor, and she felt a strange tension in the air around her as this human soldier made his way toward the central platform. She had heard stories about him for months now, and the tales seemed too wild to believe. They said he had destroyed an entire Dominion fleet with only 12 ships under his command, and they said he had walked into enemy territory alone to rescue prisoners that everyone else had given up for dead. They said he was the reason the war was finally over. Lyri studied him with careful eyes as he moved through the crowd of diplomats and military officers from 100 different worlds. He was tall for a human, and his shoulders were broad beneath his simple gray uniform that carried no medals or ribbons, despite all the honors the Coalition had tried to give him. His hair was dark with streaks of gray at the temples, and his face carried lines that spoke of too many years spent fighting and not enough years spent at peace. There was something about the way he walked that caught her attention, and she could not look away, even though she knew she should be reviewing her notes for the treaty negotiation that would begin. In less than an hour, he moved like someone who knew exactly where he belonged in any room he entered, and yet there was no arrogance in his step. It was confidence, but it was quiet, and it asked for nothing from anyone. The council chairman rose from his seat and spread his forearms wide in the traditional gesture of welcome that the Kathmari people used for honored guests. "Commander Cole," the chairman said in a voice that echoed through the vast chamber, "you stand before the representatives of 217 worlds that owe their freedom to your courage and your sacrifice." Ethan Cole stopped at the base of the platform and looked up at the chairman without any expression on his face that Lyri could read from her position in the gallery. "The Galactic Council wishes to present you with the Star of Unity," the chairman continued, "the highest honor we can bestow upon any being in the known galaxy." An assistant stepped forward carrying a small box made of crystal that held a metal shaped like a spiral of interconnected stars. The chamber waited in silence for the human to accept his reward, but Ethan Cole shook his head slowly and raised one hand to stop the assistant from coming any closer. "I thank the council for this honor," he said in a voice that was calm and steady and carried easily to every corner of the room. "But I cannot accept it." A murmur of surprise rippled through the gathered diplomats, and Lyri found herself leaning forward in her seat to hear what he would say next. "I did not fight this war for medals or glory," Ethan continued, "and I did not sacrifice the lives of good soldiers so that I could stand here and receive praise." He paused and looked around the chamber at all the faces watching him with confusion and curiosity, and in some cases admiration. "I fought because someone taught me a long time ago that the stars were meant to be shared," he said, "and I believed her then and I believe it now." The words hit Lyri like a physical blow as she gripped the railing of the gallery so hard that her knuckles turned pale. Beneath her violet skin, she did not know why those words affected her so deeply, and she told herself it was simply the emotion of the moment. The war had cost so many lives on all sides, and everyone in this room had lost someone they cared about. Perhaps she was simply tired from the long journey to reach the council station, and perhaps her hearts were heavy with the weight of what she had come here to do. Her father, the Emperor, had sent her to negotiate the peace treaty between the Etherean Empire and the Human Coalition, and it was the most important task she had ever been given. The Ethereans were one of the oldest species in the galaxy, and their empire had existed for more than 50,000 years before humanity even discovered fire. They had watched the younger species rise and fall across the centuries, and they had always believed that the stars belonged to those who were wise enough to understand them. But the humans had surprised everyone. They had burst onto the galactic stage only 300 years ago, and they had already proven themselves to be unlike any species the galaxy had ever seen. They were short-lived compared to most sentient races, and a human who reached 100 years was considered ancient. Yet somehow this made them more determined and more passionate, and more willing to risk everything for what they believed in. The war had started over resources, as most wars did, and both sides had made mistakes that led to bloodshed that no one had wanted. But it was this human soldier who had found a way to end it, and now Lyrie had to find a way to build a lasting peace from the ashes of conflict. She watched as Ethan Cole turned away from the metal and walked back through the crowd toward the exit. The diplomats parted before him like water flowing around a stone, and no one tried to stop him or call him back. Lyrie realized she was holding her breath, and she forced herself to exhale slowly and calm the racing of her twin hearts. There would be time to think about the strange feeling that had come over her when he spoke those words about the stars. For now, she had a treaty to negotiate and a peace to build, and she could not afford to be distracted by a human soldier. No matter how famous he had become, she gathered her notes and her thoughts, and she prepared herself for the work ahead. But somewhere deep inside her mind, a memory stirred like a creature waking from a long sleep, and she felt the weight of the small gray stone that she always carried in the pocket of her robes. She had carried that stone for 60 years, and she had almost forgotten why it mattered so much to her. Almost, but not quite. And as she made her way down from the gallery toward the negotiation chamber, she could not shake the feeling that something important was about to happen. Something that would change everything. She thought she knew about the war and the peace and the human soldier, who had somehow made both possible. The alien princess learns the human soldier who won the war was her childhood friend 60 years earlier, the young princess. Lyrie ran through the gardens of her family's estate on the neutral moon of Volantis Prime. She was small for her age, with skin the color of deep violets and eyes that glowed with the soft golden light that marked her as a member of the royal bloodline. Her father had sent her here to study with private tutors away from the politics of the imperial court, and she hated every moment of it. The gardens were beautiful, with flowers that sang when the wind touched them and trees that grew in spirals toward the 3 moons that hung in the sky above, but beauty meant nothing to a lonely child who had no one to share it with. She had been running for almost an hour, trying to escape the boredom of another lesson about diplomatic history, when she saw the smoke rising from behind the Crystal Hills. Her tutors had told her never to go beyond the boundary markers that surrounded the estate, but Lyrie had never been very good at following rules. She climbed the nearest hill and looked down into the valley below, and what she saw made her heart stop beating. For a long, terrible moment, a shuttle had crashed into the soft blue grass, and pieces of metal were scattered across the ground like the broken bones of some giant beast. Fire burned in several places around. The wreckage and smoke rose up into the sky in thick black columns that would surely be visible from the main house. Lyrie knew she should run back and tell her tutors what she had found, but something made her move forward instead. She slid down the hill and ran toward the crashed shuttle, with her small feet barely touching the ground. The heat from the fires made her skin tingle, but she pushed through until she reached the main body of the shuttle and looked inside through a crack in the hull. There was a boy inside. He was smaller than her, and his skin was a strange pinkish color that she had never seen before, and he was not moving. Lyrie squeezed through the crack and crawled over twisted metal and broken glass until she reached the boy and pressed her hand against his chest. His heart was beating, but it was weak and slow, and his breathing was shallow, like he might stop at any moment. She did not know what kind of creature he was, but she knew he would die if she left him here. It took her almost an hour to drag him out of the shuttle and up the hill to a small cave she had discovered during her explorations of the estate. She brought water from the stream and pressed it against his lips until he swallowed, and she tore strips from her own clothes to bandage the cuts on his arms and legs. When night fell and the 3 moons rose high in the sky, the boy finally opened his eyes. They were blue like the sky of a world she had never visited, and they looked at her with fear and confusion, and something that might have been hope. "Who are you?" He whispered in a language she did not understand, but Lyri was the daughter of an emperor, and she had been trained in linguistics. Since she could walk, and within a few hours, she had learned enough of his words to answer him. "My name is Lyri," she said slowly, "and I am going to help you." His name was Ethan, and he came from a world called Earth that was so far away, it would take 1,000 years to reach it at normal speeds. His people were called humans, and they were very new to traveling among the stars, and something had gone wrong with the ship that was carrying his family to a new colony. Did not know what had happened to his parents or his sister, and he did not know how he had ended up on this moon alone in a broken shuttle. He cried when he told her this, and Lyri held his hand because she did not know what else to do over the following weeks. She brought him food from the kitchens, and medicine from the supply rooms, and books from the library so he could learn her language properly. She told no one about him because she knew what would happen if the authorities found out that an unauthorized human had landed on Aetherian territory. There would be investigations and accusations, and the boy would be taken away to some cold facility where people in uniforms would ask him questions he could not answer. So she kept him secret, and she visited him every day, and slowly they became friends. He told her about Earth and the blue oceans and the green forests and the cities full of people who dreamed of touching the stars. She told him about the Aetherian Empire and the ancient traditions, and the burden of being born into a family that had ruled for longer than most species had existed. They were so different in so many ways, but somehow that did not matter. What mattered was that they were both lonely, and they had found each other one evening as they sat at the mouth of the cave, watching the 3 moons rise. Ethan reached into his pocket and pulled out a small gray stone. "This is from Earth," he said, "from a river where I used to play with my sister before we left for the colony ship." He pressed it into her hand and closed her fingers around it. "I want you to have it so you will remember me when I am gone." Lyri felt tears burning in her eyes, and she reached up and touched the crystal that hung from a chain around her neck. It was a piece of her family's light signature crystal, and it glowed with the same golden light as her eyes. She took it off and placed it around his neck. "This is part of me," she said, "and now it is part of you too." They made promises that night, the kind of promises that children make when they do not understand how big the universe really is. They promised to find each other again no matter how long it took, and they promised to never forget what they meant to each other. But 3 days later, her father's guards found the cave. They had been searching for the source of the crash for weeks, and they had finally tracked it to the estate grounds. Lyra screamed as they dragged Ethan away from her, and she fought against the hands that held her back. But she was just a child, and they were soldiers. The last thing she saw was his blue eyes looking back at her as they put him in a transport ship, and she heard him calling her name as the doors closed between them. She never learned what happened to him after that day. Official records said he had been returned to human territory through proper diplomatic channels, but Lyra knew that was a lie she kept. The gray stone hidden in her pocket, and she carried it with her every day for 60 years, and sometimes late at night. When she was alone, she would hold it in her hand and remember the boy who had taught her that the stars were meant to be shared. The alien princess learns the human soldier who won the war was her childhood friend. The treaty negotiations had been going on for 12 days, and Princess Lyra was exhausted in ways she had never experienced before. Every morning she walked into the conference chamber and sat across the table from Commander Ethan Cole. And every morning they argued about terms and conditions and boundaries and reparations. He was stubborn, and he refused to give ground on any point that mattered to his people. And she found herself respecting him for it, even as it made her job more difficult. Humans wanted access to the mining colonies in the outer systems, and the Aetherians wanted guarantees that human expansion would not threaten their ancient trade routes. Both sides had lost ships and soldiers and civilians in the war, and both sides carried wounds that would take generations to heal. But somehow in the middle of all that pain and anger, Commander Cole always found a way to keep the discussions moving forward. He never raised his voice, and he never insulted anyone, and he always listened carefully before he responded to any proposal. Lyrie had negotiated with diplomats from dozens of species over the years, and she had never met anyone quite like him. On the 13th day of negotiations, they reached an impasse over the question of refugee resettlement, and the talks broke down into shouting matches between the junior delegates. Lyrie called for a recess, and everyone filed out of the chamber to cool down and gather their thoughts. She walked to the observation deck on the far side of the station where the great windows looked out onto the endless field of stars. She needed to be alone, and she needed to think, and she needed to remember why she had come here in the first place. But when she reached the observation deck, she found that someone else had beaten her. There Commander Cole stood with his back to the door, and his hands clasped behind him, and he was staring out at the stars with an expression on his face that she could not read. She should have turned around and left him to his privacy, but something made her stay. "Commander," she said softly, "I did not expect to find you here." He turned to look at her, and for a moment his face was unguarded, and she saw something in his eyes that looked like sadness mixed with hope. "Princess," he replied, "I apologize if I have taken your spot." She shook her head and moved to stand beside him at the window. "The stars belong to everyone," she said, "or at least that is what we are trying to establish with this treaty." He smiled at that, and it was the first time she had seen him smile since the negotiations began. "Someone told me that once," he said, "a long time ago." They stood in silence for a few minutes, watching the distant lights of ships moving between stations and the slow rotation of a nearby planet that glowed with swirls of orange and gold. Lyrie noticed that Commander Cole was holding something in his right hand and rolling it between his fingers in a way that suggested it was a habit he had developed over many years. The object caught the light from the window, and she saw that it was a crystal about the size of her thumbnail. It glowed with a soft golden light. Her twin hearts stopped beating. She knew that light because she saw it every time she looked in a mirror, and every time she touched the crystals in the Imperial Palace. It was the light signature of the Kethvari bloodline. It was her light. "Commander," she said, and her voice was barely a whisper, "where did you get that crystal?" He stopped rolling it between his fingers and looked down at the small glowing object in his palm. "A girl gave it to me," he said slowly, 60 years ago when I was lost and alone, and she was the only person in the universe who cared whether I lived or died." Lyrie felt the world spinning around her, and she reached out to grab the railing to keep herself from falling. This was impossible. This could not be happening. She had spent 60 years trying to forget the boy she had found in the crash shuttle, and she had spent 60 years failing, but he was dead. He had to be dead. The authorities would never have let him go free after what he had seen and what he knew about ether and technology. She reached into the pocket of her diplomatic robes with a trembling hand and pulled out the small gray stone that she had carried with her every single day. Since that night in the cave, she held it up so he could see it, and the starlight from the window made it glow with a soft silver light. Commander Ethan Cole went very still, and his eyes widened, and for the first time since she had met him, he looked like he might lose control of his emotions. "You kept it," he said, and his voice cracked on the words. "You came back," she whispered. He reached out and took her hand in his, and the touch of his fingers sent electricity racing through her entire body. "I never stopped trying to find you," he said, "even when I thought you might have forgotten me." She shook her head and felt tears streaming down her violet cheeks. "I could never forget you, Ethan," she said. "I could never forget the boy who taught me that humans were worth knowing." He pulled her into an embrace, and she buried her face against his chest and let 60 years of grief and hope and longing pour out of her in great heaving Sobs she had found him. After all this time and all this distance and all this pain, she had finally found him, and he had found her. They stood there holding each other while the stars wheeled slowly past the observation window, and for a long time, neither of them said anything at all. There would be questions later, and there would be complications, and there would be people who did not understand how an Aetherian princess and a human soldier could mean so much to each other, but none of that mattered. Right now, what mattered was that two children who had made impossible promises in a cave on a distant moon had somehow kept those promises. What mattered was that the universe was smaller than anyone believed, and miracles were possible if you were willing to wait long enough for them. What mattered was that they were together again, and nothing in the galaxy was ever going to separate them again. The alien princess learns the human soldier who won the war was her childhood friend. They walked together through the empty corridors of the station, while the rest of the delegates rested in their quarters, unaware that the two lead negotiators were sharing secrets that had been buried for 6 decades. Lyrie kept glancing at Ethan, as if she expected him to disappear at any moment, and he kept reaching out to touch her arm, as if he needed to prove to himself that she was real. They found a small garden in the lower levels of the station, where plants from 100 different worlds grew together in careful harmony, and they sat on a bench beneath a tree that had silver leaves and blue flowers. "Tell me everything," Lyrie said. "Tell me what happened after they took you away." Ethan was quiet for a long moment, and she could see the shadows of old pain moving across his face. "They did not send me back to human territory," he said finally. "At least not right away. I knew it." Lyrie whispered, "I knew the official records were lies." He nodded slowly and looked down at his hands. "They took me to a facility on one of your empire's military stations," he said, "and they asked me questions about what I had seen and what I knew about Aetherian technology." Lyrie felt sick to her stomach because she had always suspected this, but hearing him say it out loud made it real in a way that hurt more than she had expected. "I was just a child," Ethan continued, "and I did not understand most of what I had seen in your gardens and your house. But they kept asking anyway. For years," he said. "They kept me in that facility for almost 5 years, and they asked me the same questions over and over again." Lyrie reached out and took his hand in hers. "I am so sorry, Ethan," she said. "I am so sorry that my people did this to you." He shook his head and squeezed her fingers gently. "It was not your fault," he said. "You were a child too, and you did everything you could to help me. But I should have done more," she insisted. "I should have told my father about you and demanded that he protect you. Your father would have had no choice but to turn me over to the authorities," Ethan said. "You know that as well as I do." She did know it, but that did not make the guilt any easier to bear. "How did you escape?" she asked. "I learned," he said simply. "I watched my guards, and I studied the layout of the facility, and I waited for the right moment." He paused, and a small smile crossed his face. "And I remembered everything you taught me about Aetherian culture and language," he continued, "which turned out to be very useful when I needed to convince people that I belong places where I did not belong." Lyrie found herself smiling, despite the tears that were still wet on her cheeks. "You always were a quick learner," she said. "I had a good teacher." He told her about his escape and the years he spent hiding in the spaces between human and Aetherian territory. He told her about the smugglers who took him in and taught him how to survive in a universe that wanted him dead. He told her about the day he finally made it back to human space and discovered that his parents and sister had died when the colony ship crashed. He was alone in every way that mattered, but he did not give up. He joined the human military because it was the only path forward that he could see, and he threw himself into his training with a desperation that surprised his instructors. Rose through the ranks faster than anyone had expected because he understood things about alien species that no other human could know, and when the war started he was ready. "I studied everything I could find about Aetherian military tactics," he said, "and I realized that your people had been using the same strategies for thousands of years because they had always worked. And you found a way to make them stop working." Lyrie said. He nodded. "Your admirals were brilliant, but they were also predictable," he said, "and I had spent years learning how Aetherians think. Because of me. Because of you." Lyrie did not know whether to feel proud or horrified. The tactics that had won the war for humanity had come from the lessons she had taught a frightened boy in a cave on a distant moon. How many Aetherian soldiers had died because she had been kind to a child who needed help? "You are thinking about the casualties," Ethan said quietly. She nodded because she could not find the words to speak. "I thought about them too," he said. "Every single day of the war." He turned to face her, and she saw that his eyes were filled with a pain that matched her own. "But I also thought about what would happen if the war continued," he said, "and I knew that more people would die on both sides every day that the fighting went on. So you ended it. As fast as I could," he said, "because every life matters, whether they are human or Aetherian or anything else." He paused and reached up to touch the crystal that still hung around his neck after all these years. "You taught me that," he said softly. "You showed me that kindness does not have to stop at the boundaries of species or empire." Lyrie felt fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. "I was just a child," she said. "I did not know what I was doing." "Neither did I," he replied. "But somehow we figured it out together." They sat in silence for a while, listening to the soft sounds of the garden and watching the lights of distant ships through the transparent ceiling above them. "What happens now?" Lyrie finally asked. "I do not know," Ethan admitted. "I have spent 60 years trying to find you, and I never really planned for what would happen when I did." "Neither did I." They looked at each other, and despite all the years and all the pain, they both started to laugh. It was the laughter of two people who had been carrying impossible weights for far too long, and who had finally found someone who understood. "I suppose we should finish negotiating this treaty," Lyrie said when the laughter faded. "I suppose we should," Ethan agreed, "and then we can figure out what comes next." He smiled, and it was the same smile she remembered from the boy in the cave all those years ago. "Together," he said. "Together." She repeated, and for the first time in 60 years, Lyra felt like everything might actually be okay. The alien princess learns the human soldier who won the war was her childhood friend. The treaty was signed on the 20th day of negotiations in a ceremony that was broadcast to every world in the galaxy. Princess Lyra stood on one side of the great table with the seal of the Aetherian Empire glowing on the wall behind her, and Commander Ethan Cole stood on the other side with the flag of the human coalition hanging above his head. The terms they had agreed upon were more generous than anyone had expected, and diplomats from both sides were already calling it the most significant peace agreement in 1,000 years. Human colonies would have access to the outer system mining operations, and Aetherian trade routes would be protected by joint patrols staffed by crews from both species. Refugees from both sides would be allowed to settle wherever they chose, and reparations would be paid not in currency, but in shared technology and medical knowledge that would benefit everyone. Journalists called it a miracle, and the historians called it unprecedented, and the politicians called it the beginning of a new era. But Lyrie and Ethan knew the truth. It was not a miracle, and it was not unprecedented. It was simply what happened when two people who understood each other decided to work toward a common goal. After the ceremony, there were parties and speeches and endless requests for interviews that neither of them wanted to give. They smiled and shook hands and said all the right things because that was what their positions required. But when night came and the crowds finally dispersed, they found each other again on the observation deck where everything had changed. "My father has summoned me home," Lyrie said as they stood together watching the stars. "I know," Ethan replied. "There will be questions about your connection to me, and implications that will need to be managed. She nodded because she had expected this from the moment she recognized the crystal in his hand. "What will you tell him?" Ethan asked. "The truth," she said, "or at least as much of the truth as he needs to hear." She turned to look at him, and she saw concern in his eyes. "My father is many things, but he is not cruel," she continued. "He will understand why I kept you secret all those years ago. And us." Ethan said, "What will he think about us?" Lyrie smiled even though she felt the weight of uncertainty pressing down on her shoulders. "I do not know," she admitted. "No Aetherian princess has ever fallen in love with a human commander before." Ethan's eyes widened slightly at her words. "Love," he repeated softly. "Is that not what this is?" she asked. "Is that not what it has always been?" He reached out and took her hands in his, and she felt the warmth of his skin against her own. "I have loved you since I was a frightened boy hiding in a cave," he said, "and I have never stopped. I have loved you since I found you bleeding in that shuttle," she replied, "and I carried that love with me every day you were gone." They stood there holding hands while the stars looked down on them like silent witnesses to promises that had been made and kept across impossible distances. "I have duties," Ethan said after a long moment. "Reconstruction efforts and veterans who need care, and a species that is still learning how to be part of something bigger than itself. And I have duties as well," Lyrie said, "an empire to serve and a father to advise and a peace to maintain. So what do we do?" She thought about the question, and she thought about all the years she had spent believing she would never see him again. She thought about the weight of the gray stone in her pocket and the glow of the crystal around his neck. She thought about two children who had promised to find each other no matter what. "We do what we have always done," she said finally. "We find a way, even if it takes another 60 years. She laughed and shook her head. "I think we have waited long enough," she said, "but I am willing to be patient if that is what we need." Ethan reached into his pocket and pulled out the crystal she had given him in the cave. At the same time, Lyrie reached into her pocket and pulled out the gray stone he had given her. They looked at each other, and without saying a word, they exchanged the tokens again. Now she held the crystal that had been around his neck for 60 years, and he held the stone that had been in her pocket for the same length of time. "This time we trade," she said. "And this time we do not let go. This time we stay connected." He agreed. The announcement came that his shuttle was ready to depart, and they walked together to the docking bay, where his crew was waiting. The soldiers looked at their commander and the princess standing side by side, and they knew better than to ask questions. "I will write to you," Ethan said. "Every day if you will let me. I will write back," she promised. "And I will find reasons to visit human space as often as I can. And I will find reasons to visit Aetherian territory." They smiled at each other, and it was the smile of two people who had finally found something they had been searching for their entire lives. "The war is over," Lyrie said, "but this is only the beginning. Then we had better get started," Ethan replied. He leaned forward and pressed his forehead against hers in the traditional Aetherian gesture of deep affection, and she felt her twin hearts beating fast in her chest. "Goodbye for now," he whispered. "Only for now." She agreed. He walked up the ramp into the shuttle, and she stood in the docking bay, watching until the doors closed behind him. The shuttle lifted off and flew through the airlock, and she ran to the observation window to watch it disappear into the infinite darkness of space. In her hand, the gray stone from Earth was warm from his touch around his neck. The golden crystal from her bloodline was glowing brighter than it ever had before. They were separated by the void between stars, but they were connected by something stronger than distance or time or the boundaries between species. They were connected by a promise that two children had made in a cave on a distant Mona. Promise that the stars were meant to be shared, a promise that had survived war and loss and 60 years of silence, a promise that would guide them both home. Lyrie watched the shuttle until it was nothing more than a speck of light among millions of others, and then she smiled and turned away. She had a peace to build and a galaxy to heal, and a love to nurture across the impossible distances between worlds. But she was not afraid, because she knew that no matter how far apart they were, she and Ethan would always find their way back to each other. That was what the stars were for. That was what they had always been for, to bring lost children home. The end.